The forward briefing suite aboard the Sovereign Call was not designed for comfort. 6 days in transit from the Drevaan Corridor to the home system gave it time to become something between an office and a cell. The overhead panels put out a flat white light that made everyone look pale, and the ventilation recycled air that always smelled faintly of ozone and hydraulic lubricant from whatever engineering problem the crew hadn't yet traced to its source. The table was bolted to the deck. The 4 chairs were bolted to the table. The display screen occupied the entire forward bulkhead and was almost never off, because when you were 6 days from the nearest command node, and you had a briefing that the Strategic Council was already waiting for, you didn't sleep much and you didn't leave the screen dark for long. I am Veloran in Sec. I hold the rank of Senior Intelligence Assessment Officer in the Keth-Vraani Combined Arms Directorate, and I have held that rank for 19 years. In those 19 years, I have written 43 campaign assessments, and I have been wrong in some measurable dimension in 9 of them. I keep that number. I revisit it at the start of every new assessment, because the profession of intelligence is fundamentally a profession of managing the distance between what you know and what is true, and the only honest accounting you can give yourself is a number. I am writing this record because the Strategic Council has asked for a full personal account, not just the formal assessment, which they already have, but the sequence of understanding as it happened aboard this ship, in that briefing suite, in the 6 days it took us to cross the Drevaan Transit Corridor and return home. They want to know what we knew, when we knew it, and the precise moment each of us understood that we had been looking at the human capability envelope from the wrong angle entirely. I will give them that, all of it. The Drevaan campaign began as a straightforward operation. I want to be precise about this because it matters. We did not begin it carelessly. We did not begin it from ignorance or arrogance. We began it from a thorough pre-campaign assessment that had been reviewed by 3 separate analytical divisions and approved at the directorate level. When I say we believed we had mapped the human response, I am not describing a failure of diligence. I am describing a failure of category. We had mapped everything we knew to look for. The humans had things we didn't know to look for. That is a different kind of failure, and the Strategic Council needs to understand the distinction. Let me give you the briefing, as I gave it to the 4 officers on the morning of transit day 1. Subdirector Keth-Vraani arrived first, as she always did. She took the chair on my right, set her reading surface on the table, and said nothing. She is a quiet officer who prefers data to conversation, and in 19 years I have never seen her rattled by a briefing, which is part of why I wanted her in the room. Senior Analyst Keth-Vraani came in behind her, poured himself a measure of the dark stimulant concentrate from the dispenser in the corner, and sat across from Keth-Vraani. Then Fleet Coordinator Vorasaran, who was the most senior officer in the room, and therefore the one the council would hold most accountable, who folded his hands on the table and looked at me with an expression I had seen on his face before, not dismissal, not impatience, but a kind of pre-briefing suspension, the look of a commander who has trained himself to receive information before reacting to it. And finally, Tactical Records Officer Sevon Keth, young for her rank, meticulous, whose job was to log every exchange in the briefing suite for the council record, and who set her transcription array on the table and activated it without a word. I put the first engagement log on the screen. The Drevaan Corridor campaign, I said, ran across 6 primary engagements over 19 days. The Directorate's pre-campaign assessment projected a human response capacity consistent with historical records. Specifically, the Veth-Yoran engagement patterns from the prior 2 years, which had given us a reliable characterization of the human capability ceiling in this theater. We expected a contested corridor. We did not expect what the footage will show. I let that sit for a moment, then I started the first log. The first engagement was clean. I want to say that clearly because it matters to everything that followed. On day 3 of the campaign, our forward strike element entered the Drevaan approach and encountered the first human response. a system designated in our records as Type Veth call, which had a known power signature, known engagement geometry, and a flight profile we had logged in 4 prior encounters. Our analysts had characterized it accurately. Our tactical teams had trained against its parameters. The engagement lasted 11 minutes and 40 seconds, and at the end of it, the human response system was withdrawn from the field, and the approach corridor was ours. Subdirector Keth-Vraani made a notation on her reading surface. Senior analyst Keth-Vraani drank his concentrate. Fleet coordinator Drevaan watched the screen without comment. This was exactly what the pre-campaign assessment had said would happen. The second engagement on day 6 was similar. A second human response system entered the corridor, Type Veth Mara in our designation system, slightly more capable than Type Veth call but well within our map parameters. We had logged this system in 7 prior encounters across 2 years of corridor operations. Its power signature was familiar. Its engagement doctrine was familiar. Our tactical teams handled it in 16 minutes and the corridor held. At this point, I told the 4 officers, the Directorate's assessment remained intact. We had encountered the 2 primary human response systems we expected to encounter. Both had performed within predicted parameters. Both had been successfully contested. The assessment models projected that the human capacity in this theater was effectively exhausted, that we had seen the ceiling, that the next engagements would be lower intensity and defensive in character. This projection was the product of 2 years of engagement data and 3 divisions of analysis. I paused there. I always pause there in the retelling, because it is important to establish precisely how solid the ground felt beneath our feet at that moment. When the ground shifts, you need to know what solid felt like. The third engagement began on day 9. I put the footage on the screen and I watched the 4 officers watch it, and I watched the moment each of them registered that something was wrong. It was not a dramatic moment. It was quiet, the way the beginning of real trouble is always quiet. A small wrongness in a familiar picture, a number that doesn't match the pattern, a shape on a screen that your eye keeps returning to because it doesn't fit the model. The third human response system that entered the Drevaan Corridor on day 9 did not match either of the previous 2. The power signature was different, not a variation on the Type Veth call or Type Veth Mara signatures, not a modification, not an upgrade along the same development line. It was structurally different. Different emission profile, different energy distribution across the engagement envelope, different flight geometry. The engagement doctrine it demonstrated was not a variant of the human doctrines we had logged. The way it used the corridor, the angles it took, the distance thresholds it seemed to prefer, none of it matched. And the tactical teams who engaged it, who had trained against the known systems, had to adapt in real time. Senior analyst Keth-Vraani set down his concentrate. The engagement lasted 31 minutes. We held the corridor, but the margins were different. When this footage reached me during the campaign, I said, my initial assessment was reserve capability. The humans had kept a third system in reserve, one we hadn't seen before, and had deployed it when the first 2 systems were insufficient. This is a reasonable conclusion. It's what the data suggested at the time. I filed a modified assessment noting the expanded capability envelope and projecting that the third system represented the new ceiling. I want the Strategic Council to understand that this modification was reasonable given the information available. Fleet Coordinator Drevaan looked at me. He had the expression of a man who already knows there is a 4th engagement log on the screen. There was. Day 12, the 4th engagement. I let the footage run. I did not narrate it. The 4 officers watched, and then I watched them process it the same way I had processed it when the raw footage reached me aboard this ship 4 days into transit. The same sequence of recognition, rejection, and then the slow, unwilling arrival at understanding. The 4th human response system, was not the third one. It was not a variant of the third one. It was not built on the same development lineage as the third one. It was structurally independent, different power source configuration, different structural mass distribution, different engagement range preferences, different tactical signature entirely. Where the third system had favored close corridor engagement, the fourth used standoff distances and energy projection techniques we had not previously recorded in the human response inventory for this theater. Where the third system had moved with a specific rotational geometry that our analysts could characterize and predict, the fourth moved differently, not faster, not more capable in every dimension, but different in the precise ways that made everything we had adapted to for the third system not apply. The tactical teams adapted again. They held again. But the engagement took 44 minutes, and I want you to understand what 44 minutes means in a corridor operation. The margin it consumes, the exposure it creates, the cost of adapting doctrine in contact when the thing you're adapting to is something your pre-campaign assessment never told you to prepare for. The briefing suite was very quiet. Subdirector Keth-Vraani had stopped making notations. She was watching the screen with the focused stillness of an analyst who has stopped annotating because she needs all of her attention to understand what she's seeing. Keth-Vraani had his hands flat on the table. Vorasaran was leaning slightly forward, which I had never seen him do. And Drevaan Keth, the transcription officer, was doing her job, logging everything. But I could see in her peripheral expression that she was also doing the other thing. The thing everyone in that room was doing, which was quietly revising the model. There were 2 more engagement logs after the fourth. I want to describe them, because the briefing did not stop at day 12, and neither did the campaign. Engagement 5 was on day 15. I had expected by that point to be past the acute phase of the problem. The fourth system had been contained. We had held the corridor through 4 contested engagements. The planning staff had adjusted the tactical parameters to account for the widened envelope. The assumption, and I want to be precise about how specific this assumption was, because it informs everything, was that the humans had now committed their available assets. 4 systems across 4 engagements represented, in any rational force management model, a substantial deployment. The reserve, if there was one, would be thin. The 5th engagement was not thin. I put the footage on the screen, and Vorasaran said something I had never heard him say, which was nothing. He had a response to every briefing frame I had ever shown him, a question, a notation request, a redirect to a different parameter. He watched the 5th engagement footage in complete silence for 11 minutes, and then he said, "That's a different power profile from the other 4. "Yes," I said. "It's not the reserve system for one of the 4 we've already seen. The emission characteristics don't match any of the 4. Our analysts have run the comparison 3 times. "Then it's a 5th program," he said. Not a question, a statement of fact that he was working out in real time. "That is the assessment," I said. The 5th system had entered the corridor on day 15 from a different approach vector than any of the previous 4, not because the corridor geometry had changed, but because this system used a different spatial positioning preference in its engagement doctrine. Where the previous 4 had all engaged along the central axis, this one favored the corridor margins, which created a different kind of tactical problem for our teams because the assets deployed for central axis defense weren't optimally positioned for margin engagement. The tactical teams adapted. They always adapted, but adaptation under contact is an expenditure. Every adjustment costs time, costs margin, costs certainty, and we had been adapting for 15 days. The 5th engagement ran 58 minutes. That is the longest human engagement in the Drevaan Corridor, record by 14 minutes. The 6th engagement was on day 19, and it was brief, 22 minutes, but the brevity was misleading, and I want to explain why. The sixth human system that entered the corridor on day 19 was, in several technical parameters, the most capable we had encountered in the campaign. Not dramatically more capable across all dimensions, but specifically more capable in the precise dimensions that the tactical teams were most dependent on by day 19. Which is to say, the dimensions in which our teams had been accumulating friction and degradation across 6 consecutive engagements. It was as if whoever had sent this system into the corridor on day 19 had a detailed understanding of what our tactical teams were most tired of dealing with. The engagement was brief because our teams withdrew to consolidate after 22 minutes. This was a tactical decision, not a rout. But it was also the first time in the Drevaan campaign that the Keth-Vraani element had withdrawn. The campaign closed with the corridor in contested status. I stopped the footage after the 6th engagement log. The briefing suite was quiet in a way that was different from any of the quiet it had produced before. In the earlier silences, the room was processing individual revelations, a new system, a new capability parameter, a new pilot behavior. By the time I stopped the footage on day 19, there was nothing left to process in isolation. It was all one thing. 6 engagements, 6 human response systems, none of them built on the same development lineage as any of the others, and a corridor that had gone from clear to contested in 19 days not because the humans had a superior integrated force, but because they had, sequentially, deployed things we had not anticipated, built by teams we had not mapped, operated by pilots who treated each new system as a vehicle rather than a specialty. I let the screen show all 6 engagement thumbnails in a single row. Then I spoke. 4 systems, I said, in 4 engagements, 2 of which the pre-campaign assessment had characterized accurately, 2 of which it had not anticipated at all. I let that land, then I corrected myself. 6 systems, I said, in 6 engagements, 2 characterized, 4 not anticipated. The corridor is contested. The campaign assessment requires comprehensive revision. I waited. Where did the 3rd through 6 systems come from? Drevaan asked. That is the central question of this briefing, I said. And the answer is what the Strategic Council needs to understand before they make any further decisions about the Drevaan Theater. I pulled up the analytical package my team had assembled during transit. It had taken 4 officers working in shifts for the better part of 3 days, and the work was thorough. We had taken the engagement footage of all 4 systems, extracted every measurable parameter, and run comparison analysis. Power signature characteristics, structural mass and geometry as approximated from engagement performance, energy emission profiles, tactical doctrine as inferred from movement patterns and engagement decisions. And we had tried to answer the question of what these 4 systems had in common, what developmental relationship connected them, what single human program or facility or command chain had produced them. The answer was that they did not appear to share one. I let the comparison matrix sit on the screen for a long moment before I explained it. I find that images carry weight that words take longer to deliver, and I wanted the weight to arrive before the explanation, so that when the explanation came it would have somewhere to land. The matrix showed 4 columns, 1 for each human response system, and across each column ran the technical parameters we had measured: power source configuration, structural geometry, tactical doctrine signature, engagement range preferences, energy emission profiles, pilot interface characteristics inferred from response latency data. Almost nothing aligned. The systems that the humans had fielded in the Drevaan Corridor across 4 engagements did not look like variants of each other. They did not look like a development program with iterations. They looked like 4 independent programs that had been built separately, by separate teams, towards separate design philosophies, and had then been deployed sequentially when the tactical situation required. The third system's energy profile, I said, matches a signature cluster we have logged in 3 prior engagements in the northern sectors, engagements that had no operational connection to the Drevaan Theater. The humans who built it, or the program that produced it, have been operational in the north for at least 2 years. They were not a Drevaan-specific development. They were a pre-existing capability that was redirected. I moved to the fourth column. The fourth system's tactical doctrine signature matches patterns from a separate sector entirely, the Keth-Vraani engagement records, 8 months prior. Different engagement, different region, same behavioral signatures. Whatever program produced the fourth system has been operating independently of both the Drevaan Theater and the Northern Sector programs for at least 8 months. Fleet Coordinator Vorisaran spoke for the first time in 40 minutes. He said, "They don't centralize them." "No," I said. "They do not appear to." I want to explain what that means, because it is not immediately obvious, and because when I understood it fully, when I sat in this same chair in this same briefing suite on transit day 2 and worked through the analysis until it became clear, the implication was sufficiently significant that I stopped the work and sat with it for an hour before I continued. Every major spacefaring civilization in our contact records develops combat capability through centralized programs. This is not a political choice. It is an engineering necessity. You need shared infrastructure, shared supply chains, shared maintenance systems. You need doctrine that integrates across the force. You need command channels that can coordinate assets and deploy them where they're needed. The alternative independent programs producing structurally incompatible systems and operating under separate command structures is wildly inefficient. You duplicate effort. You can't share parts. You can't cross-train pilots. You can't write unified doctrine. The waste is enormous. Every major civilization we know of, faced with this engineering reality, converges on integration. You build toward compatibility. You standardize. You develop one response system or a family of response systems built on the same platform, and you deploy it everywhere. The humans had not done this. What the Drevaan footage showed was not 4 systems from a unified program. It was 4 systems from what appeared to be 4 separate development lineages that had been running in parallel, perhaps for years, perhaps for longer, without integrating with each other. The scientists and engineers who had built the third system had apparently not built the fourth system, and neither of them had built the first 2. The humans had not rationalized their capability development. They had let it proliferate. From a pure resource allocation standpoint, this is an extraordinary waste. From a tactical assessment standpoint, it is a nightmare. Keth-Vraani understood it before I stated it explicitly. I saw it happen, the moment her expression shifted from focus to something quieter, something that was not quite alarm but was the precondition for alarm, the cognitive state you enter when you realize that the threat model you've been working from doesn't have the right shape. "You can't assess their ceiling," she said. "No," I said. "Because you don't know how many programs there are." "No." She looked at the comparison matrix on the screen. The pre-campaign assessment characterized 2 systems. The campaign encountered 4, but the 4 we encountered were not the universe of human systems. They were the systems the humans chose to deploy in this theater in this campaign sequentially. There could be, she stopped. "The historical record," I said, "gives us contact data on 12 distinct human response systems across all theaters over the past 4 years. The Directorate's assessment had grouped them into 3 developmental families based on shared technical parameters. This analysis," I indicated the matrix on the screen, "suggests that grouping was incorrect. The parameters we used to identify family relationships were not reliable indicators of developmental origin. What we interpreted as family resemblances may have been coincidental convergences in systems that were independently developed." Keth-Vraani said, very quietly, "So we don't know how many families there are." We don't know, I said. And we don't have a reliable method for determining it from external observation, because the humans don't appear to publish integration records or unified acquisition data. What we have is contact data from engagements, and contact data tells you what systems exist only insofar as those systems have been used. The systems that haven't been used yet don't appear in the record. The briefing suite was quiet in a particular way. Not the silence of a room where people have nothing to say, but the silence of a room where people are working, where minds are running over implications and finding that the implications keep extending further than expected. I gave them time. This is a discipline I have developed over 19 years of delivering intelligence assessments. You give the room time to work, because the room is smarter than you are individually. And if you fill the silence with your own voice, you rob yourself of the thinking the room would have done. Vorasaran broke the silence after perhaps 8 minutes. He said, "Walk me through the pilot data." This was a perceptive question. I had expected it from Drevaan, but Vorasaran had gotten there first. The pilot data was the other part of the assessment, the part that, in some ways, troubled me more than the systems analysis. In all 4 Drevaan engagements, the human pilots had adapted. This is not, by itself, unusual. Any competent pilot adapts. What was unusual was the character of the adaptation. The specific ways the pilots had responded when the Keth-Vraani tactical teams had successfully nullified a previously effective technique. I pulled up the pilot tracking data from the engagement logs. We had been able to isolate individual signatures across the engagements with reasonable confidence. The humans didn't change their pilots between engagements, or at least they didn't change all of them. Several signatures recurred. I want to focus on 2. The pilot we designated Signature Call had appeared in engagements 1 and 3. In engagement 1, operating the type Veth call system, this pilot had used a set of engagement patterns that our tactical teams had characterized and countered within the first 4 minutes of contact. The counter was effective. The pilot's technique was neutralized, and the human system withdrew. In engagement 3, the same pilot appeared again, now operating the structurally different third system, the one with the different power signature and different tactical doctrine. And this pilot, in a system they had apparently not operated in any prior logged engagement with us, using techniques that had not appeared in any prior contact record, adapted within the engagement to our counter techniques in real time. The adaptation was not random, it was targeted. The pilot identified, within the engagement, which of our techniques were creating the most pressure on their position, and adjusted specifically to reduce the effectiveness of those techniques. Not to escape them, the engagement was contested throughout, but to reduce their margin, to buy time, to stay in the fight long enough for the tactical situation to shift. This pilot, I said, operated 2 different systems in 2 different engagements. The systems had different performance envelopes, different strengths and limitations, different optimal engagement geometries. The pilot demonstrated competence with both, not just functional competence, but the kind of adaptive, pressure-sensitive competence that you only develop through extensive operational experience. Either this pilot had spent substantial time training in both systems, or they adapted to the second system's characteristics faster than our assessment models would have projected. Drevaan said, or both. Or both, I agreed. The second signature I wanted to highlight was the pilot we designated Signature Mara, who had appeared in engagements 2 and 4. The pattern was similar, 2 different systems, 2 different engagements, demonstrated competence with both. But in this case, the 4th engagement had given us something additional. At one point in the footage, Signature Mara's system had suffered a partial failure of its primary engagement mechanism. We could identify this from the emission data, a disruption in the power delivery to whatever system the 4th human type used for its primary function. The pilot had continued the engagement for 11 minutes after this failure, using secondary systems and modified tactics before withdrawing. 11 minutes, with a primary system down, against a fresh Keth-Vraani tactical element that knew the system was compromised. The pilot's tactical decision-making during those 11 minutes, I said, is the section of the engagement log I would ask the Strategic Council to study most carefully, because the decisions are not reactive. They are not frantic. They are deliberate, a sequential set of adjustments, each one building on the previous one, each one apparently designed to extend the engagement and deny our tactical teams the certainty of a resolution. The pilot did not attempt to escape. The pilot attempted to remain useful. Keth-Vraani said, "Why would a pilot in a compromised system continue the engagement?" "I don't know," I said. "That is one of several things about the human pilots in this campaign that I cannot explain from our existing models. What I can tell you is that the behavior appears consistent across multiple pilots, across multiple engagements, in systems built by what appear to be separate development programs. The humans who flew the first system and the humans who flew the fourth system were apparently trained by different programs, equipped by different programs, and operating under what may have been different command structures. But their behavior under pressure was similar." I paused. "They stay," I said. "When our models would project disengagement, they stay. When the engagement margin goes against them, they stay. Not because they aren't aware the margin has shifted, the adaptive behavior shows that they're fully aware. They stay because staying in their decision framework is not yet the wrong choice. And the threshold at which staying becomes the wrong choice appears to be located much further along the pressure curve than our models place it." This had been in the pre-campaign assessment, in attenuated form. The Directorate's analysts had noted human pilot persistence as a factor and had incorporated a persistence multiplier into the engagement duration projections. But the multiplier had been derived from the prior 2 years of engagement data, which had all been against the 2 known system types. It turned out that persistence was not a characteristic of the known system types. It was a characteristic of the pilots. And when pilots with that characteristic were flying systems we hadn't seen before, the persistence interacted with the unfamiliar performance envelope in ways that the multiplier hadn't captured. Vorasaran said, "What did they communicate during the engagements?" I had anticipated this question. I had a partial answer, which was worse than no answer in some respects, because a partial answer creates the illusion of understanding. "We were able to intercept some interpilot communication during engagements 3 and 4, I said. "The content was consistent with what you'd expect: tactical coordination, positional updates, system status reports. There was no content that appeared to be doctrine transmitted from a command element. The pilots were not receiving real-time tactical guidance from a superior. They were coordinating with each other." Vorasaran processed this. They were making their own decisions. "Within an engagement," I said, "yes. The coordination we observed was lateral, pilot to pilot, not command to pilot. They were sharing information and making adjustments collectively without waiting for direction from above." This was another factor that the pre-campaign assessment had understated. We had modeled the human command structure as broadly similar to our own, a command element that manages the tactical picture and directs assets. That model produces certain predictions about how a force behaves when the engagement goes badly. The command element identifies the problem, issues updated direction, and the force adjusts on a lag that corresponds to the communication cycle. We had built our engagement models around exploiting that lag. The human pilots in the Drevaan campaign did not appear to operate on that lag. The lateral coordination we observed was faster than vertical command cycles. When something changed in the engagement, they told each other and adjusted. The command element, if there was one in the traditional sense, appeared to be functioning at a longer timescale, setting parameters before the engagement rather than directing it during. Within the engagement, the pilots ran themselves. Does the Strategic Council know about this? Keth-Vraani asked. The summary assessment mentions it, I said, but I don't believe the Council has worked through what it means for engagement modeling. That's part of what I'm doing here. The summary assessment I had transmitted ahead of the Savrith call's arrival had been necessarily compressed. The Council had received, essentially, 4 human response systems encountered in 6 engagements, 2 systems previously unknown, pilot persistence and lateral coordination above predicted parameters. Pre-campaign assessment requires revision. The full implications of that summary, the ones that had kept my analytical team running in shifts for 3 days, had not been transmittable in compressed form. Let me set out those implications here, because this is the record the Strategic Council needs. The Directorate's prior approach to the human response envelope had been founded on a specific assumption, that the humans, like every other spacefaring civilization we had catalogued, would converge toward a unified capability architecture over time. More programs would be consolidated. Standards would be imposed. The patchwork of independent development efforts would eventually be rationalized into a coherent force structure, because efficiency demands it, and any rational command authority eventually chooses efficiency. This assumption had been producing assessments of the human capability ceiling that described a ceiling which did not exist. Every time we encountered a system we hadn't seen before, we added it to the inventory and revised the ceiling upward. 2 systems became 4. 4 might become 8. We had been treating each new system as a surprise, an intelligence failure, a gap in our coverage that we needed to close. But what if it wasn't a gap? What if the humans weren't hiding these systems from us? What if they were simply producing them, continuously, through a dispersed network of development programs that had no central integration point for us to map? In that case, there is no ceiling we can identify. There is only the ceiling we've encountered so far, which is always smaller than the real one by an unknown amount. Consider what this looks like from the outside. A campaign planner sitting in a directorate office, preparing the pre-campaign assessment for the Drevaan Corridor, asks the right question: what can the humans deploy against us? The analyst pulls the historical engagement record, identifies the known human response systems, characterizes their performance parameters, and builds a model. This model is not wrong. It accurately describes the systems that have appeared in prior engagements. It is as accurate as the data allows. What the model does not tell you, what no pre-campaign model built from engagement data can tell you, is how many other programs exist that have never appeared in an engagement, because they have never been asked to. The humans don't have a central capability registry that our intelligence apparatus can map. They don't publish acquisition records in a form we have access to. The development programs that produced the 3rd system, the 4th, the 5th, the 6th, they existed before the Drevaan campaign. They were presumably producing, testing, developing, training pilots. None of this was visible to us. We weren't looking for it because we had no reason to believe it existed. And we had no reason to believe it existed because our assessment architecture assumed centralization. Think about what centralization means for an intelligence assessment. If a civilization centralizes its capability development, you map the center and you've mapped the capability. The center is findable. It has a physical location, an organizational structure, supply chains that flow to and from it, personnel rosters, maintenance cycles. These things leave traces. An intelligence apparatus designed to find traces will find the center, and once you've found the center, you've found the capability envelope. The entire approach rests on the premise that capability is concentrated, because if it's concentrated, it's findable. The humans in the Drevaan theater had not concentrated. I want to be careful here, because I don't want to overstate the implication. I am not saying the humans are invincible. I am not saying their capabilities are limitless. I am saying that our method for assessing their capability ceiling has been systematically wrong in a specific way. We have been treating the systems we've encountered as representative of the systems that exist, and there is substantial reason to believe they are not representative. We have been mapping a sample and calling it the population. There is a further implication that I raised in the formal assessment and want to develop more fully here. If the humans have an unknown number of independent development programs, the question of how those programs communicate and coordinate is important not just for intelligence purposes but for campaign planning. A dispersed capability that cannot be coordinated in deployment is less dangerous than a dispersed capability that can be coordinated flexibly. The Drevaan footage suggests that the deployment coordination, the decision to send the third system when the second was insufficient, and then the fourth, and then the fifth, and then the sixth, was made by the theater command on a relatively short cycle. Less than 48 hours elapsed between the withdrawal of one system and the deployment of the next in each case. If the theater command had to negotiate with independent programs for each deployment, and if those negotiations completed in under 48 hours, then either the negotiation process was very efficient or some prior arrangement had been made that reduced the negotiation to a simple request and response. This matters because it tells us something about the human's awareness of their own capability structure. If they have made prior arrangements with their independent programs, if there is some standing agreement that amounts to a deployment network, then they understand that they have multiple programs. They understand that coordination is necessary, and they have built the coordination mechanism. That is a deliberate architecture. And a deliberate architecture can be studied and potentially disrupted, but it first has to be found. Senior analyst Keth-Vraani asked the question that was now obvious. How do we fix the assessment? I don't know that we can, I said, not using the methods we've been using. He looked at me. Our assessment methods are predicated on the assumption that capabilities have to be centralized to be effective, I said. That's why we look for central nodes, development facilities, command structures, logistics hubs. We map those, and we believe we've mapped the capability. The humans appear to be running an assessment-resistant architecture, not deliberately, but as a side effect of how they develop and maintain systems. There is no central node that, if identified and mapped, gives you the complete picture. There are only points of engagement, and each point of engagement gives you one more data point about a population we still haven't characterized. Vorsaran said, if they're not centralizing, how are they coordinating deployment? Something had to decide to send the third system into Drevaan when the first two were insufficient. This was the question I had spent the most time on. I had not arrived at a complete answer, but I had arrived at a partial one, which I believed was the most honest thing I could offer. The deployment decision appears to have been made by the theater command. There is a human command structure for the Drevaan region, and it has authority to call in capabilities from outside the region when the situation requires it. What the theater command called in was not necessarily specified in advance. They asked for what they needed. The independent programs that could answer the call responded. This is a different command model than we had been using, not deploy the reserve, but ask the network what it has. I let that sit. The implication, I continued, is that the effective capability inventory in any given theater is not fixed in advance. It depends on what programs have assets available and choose to respond. Which programs exist, what assets they have, and whether they'll respond when asked. None of those things are stable parameters that a pre-campaign assessment can establish with confidence. The quiet in the briefing suite had changed character by this point. The room was still working, still processing, but the quality of the silence was different from what it had been when we started. In the first hour, it had been the silence of people learning new information. In the second hour, it had been the silence of people working through implications. By this point, 3 hours into the briefing, it was the silence of people who had arrived somewhere they hadn't expected to arrive, and who were taking the measure of the place. "I want to return to the pilot data before we close," I said, "because there's one more dimension of it that the formal assessment mentions but doesn't fully develop." I pulled up the engagement duration statistics for all 6 Drevaan engagements side by side. Engagements 1 and 2 ran 11 and 16 minutes respectively. These are within normal parameters for contested corridor operations against known human systems. Engagements 3 and 4 ran 31 and 44 minutes. This is not a function of the systems being more capable. On a pure performance parameter basis, the third and fourth systems were not dramatically superior to the first 2. The engagement duration increase is a function of the pilots. I zoomed in on the 4th engagement timeline. The pilot we designated Signature Mara, operating with a compromised primary system, extended the engagement 11 minutes past the point at which our engagement models would have predicted withdrawal. But the other pilots in that engagement also extended past model predictions. Not as dramatically, Signature Mara is the clearest case, but consistently. Every human pilot in every engagement ran longer than the model said they should. Keth-Vraani said, "They calibrated the model using historical engagement data." "Yes." "Which was also against human pilots." "Yes." She understood what that meant. The model had been calibrated against human pilots who were already running longer than some theoretical baseline would predict. So the model already had human persistence baked in, and the Drevaan pilots were still exceeding it. How much of the model's persistence multiplier was developed from Keth-Vraani engagement data specifically, versus broader cross-species data? I had run this analysis. Approximately 40% of the model's persistence factor is derived from Keth-Vraani historical engagements. The remainder is derived from broader multi-theater records. If the Keth-Vraani historical engagements were already encountering pilots at the high end of the human persistence distribution, I stopped, because I didn't need to complete the sentence. "We may have built the ceiling into the model," Drevaan said. "It's possible," I said. "We calibrated against the pilots we had engaged before. If those pilots were representative of the average, the model is accurate. If they were not, if the Drevaan pilots were drawn from a different part of the distribution, the model will systematically underestimate. And we have no way to know where in the distribution we've been sampling," Keth-Vraani said. "No, we don't." I let the engagement duration chart stay on the screen while the room processed this. It was a simple chart. It didn't look like the most important piece of data in the briefing, but the Strategic Council needed to understand what it meant. What it meant was that our engagement models for the Drevaan theater, and by extension for all theaters where we had relied on human historical engagement data to calibrate persistence factors, were built on a sample of pilots we had engaged before. Pilots who had been willing to engage us. Pilots who had engaged us and whose engagement records we had logged. This sample was not random. It was a specific population. Humans who had made contact with us in a combat context, whose behavior had been recorded, and who had contributed to the database our analysts drew on. If there were human pilots who were significantly more persistent than that sample, if the Drevaan pilots represented a higher persistence cohort, recruited specifically for the corridor defense, then every model we had built from historical data was telling us something accurate about the pilots who had fought us before, and something unreliable about the pilots we might encounter in the future. After about 10 minutes, Drevaan spoke. "What does the Directorate recommend?" I had known this question was coming. I had been thinking about how to answer it honestly since Transit Day 2, when I had first worked through the full analysis and understood where it led. "I am going to recommend 3 things," I said. "The first recommendation is that the Directorate suspend the current assessment models for human response capability and rebuild them from first principles, using the Drevaan engagement data as the calibration set rather than the prior historical record. The prior record is not wrong, but it appears to be systematically biased in the direction of underestimating human capability. The new models need to account for the possibility of multiple independent development programs and non-centralized deployment. The second recommendation is that the Directorate establish a dedicated analytical effort to characterize the human development ecosystem, not to identify individual capabilities, but to understand the structure of how capabilities are produced. How many independent programs appear to exist? What is the range of technical approaches they take? How do they communicate and coordinate in deployment? These questions are difficult to answer from engagement data alone, but they are the right questions to be asking. The third recommendation is that campaign planners in all theaters be notified that the human capability inventory in any given theater is not a closed set. Encounter data represents a lower bound on what exists. Planners should assume that the humans may deploy systems they have not previously encountered, and that this is not an intelligence failure. It is a property of the human development architecture. I let those three recommendations sit for a moment. I'll add a fourth observation, I said, which is not a formal recommendation but which I think the Council should hear. In 19 years of intelligence assessment work, I have worked against many different adversaries. The adversaries that are easiest to assess are the ones who concentrate. They build things in one place. They train in one way. They command from one structure. When you find the center, you've found the adversary. The adversaries that are hardest to assess are the ones who don't concentrate, who develop in parallel, command laterally, and adapt without waiting for direction from above. The humans in the Drevaan Theater behaved like the second kind. I don't know whether this is a choice they made deliberately, an emergent property of their civilization's history and culture, or something else entirely. What I know is that the assessment approach we've been using was designed for the first kind, and it produced systematic errors when applied to the second. Keth-Vraani said, "When you say we don't know whether it's deliberate, you mean we don't know whether they know they're assessment resistant." "Correct," I said. "It's possible the humans understand that their dispersed development architecture makes them harder to assess, and have maintained it deliberately for that reason. It's also possible it simply evolved that way, that they never centralized because the independent programs were each effective in their own right, and the political or institutional friction required to integrate them was never overcome. In either case, the effect is the same, but the implication for how we approach them is different. If it's deliberate, they will maintain and potentially deepen it when they understand we've recognized it. If it's not deliberate, they may not." "Can we tell the difference?" Keth-Vraani asked. "Not from what we have," I said. We sat with that. The briefing formally ended approximately 40 minutes later, after we had worked through the formal recommendations and the language for the Strategic Council report. But I want to record the last exchange, because it is the one that has stayed with me through the remainder of the transit. Keth-Vraani had stayed behind after the others left. He is a careful analyst who thinks slowly and thoroughly, and he sometimes arrives at things after the briefing rather than during it. He stood by the display screen, which still showed the comparison matrix, the 4 columns of human response systems, the parameters that didn't align, the 4 development lineages that the Drevaan campaign had forced us to recognize. "There's something I keep coming back to," he said. "Tell me." The 2 pilots who appeared in multiple engagements, Signature Call, Signature Mara, they flew 2 different systems. They performed with both. You said either they trained extensively in both systems, or they adapted very quickly. "Yes." "What if the answer isn't either-or?" he said. "What if the adaptation isn't quick because they have exceptional individual capacity? What if it's quick because the systems, despite being built by different programs with different technical philosophies, share something that makes cross-system competence easier than it should be? Something we can't see in the technical parameters because we don't know what to measure." I had not thought of it in exactly those terms. I had been approaching the pilot adaptation as a capability of the pilots. Keth-Vraani was suggesting it might also be a property of the systems, that beneath the surface differences, something was shared that made human pilots transferable across them. That would imply, I said slowly, a level of underlying commonality that the technical parameters don't reflect. It would imply something connects them that we're not measuring, he said, which would also explain why our family grouping methodology failed. We were measuring the wrong things. I looked at the matrix. 4 columns, 4 systems that, on every parameter we had measured, appeared to be from separate development lineages. And the possibility that we were measuring the wrong parameters. Add that to the assessment, I said, as an open question. He nodded and left. I stayed in the briefing suite for a while after that. The screen showed the matrix. The ship hummed around me, the particular low-frequency vibration of the Savrith Call's drive system that you stopped noticing after 2 days and started noticing again after 6. In 21 years, I had been a junior analyst for 2 years before reaching senior officer rank. I had written 43 campaign assessments. 9 of them had been wrong in some measurable dimension. I was revising the pre-campaign assessment for the Drevaan Corridor, which would become the 10th. The revision was not, in the traditional sense, a correction of errors. The original assessment had been thorough. It had been built on the best available data. It had correctly characterized the systems it had information about. What it had failed to do was account for the systems it had no information about, not because they were hidden or because our intelligence collection was inadequate, but because the question it had been designed to answer, what human response capability exists in this theater, was the wrong question. The right question was how many independent human development programs might have relevant assets, and whether any of them would choose to respond if the theater command asked. And that question we had never thought to ask. We had not asked it because the assumption embedded in our assessment methodology was that the answer was one program, one architecture, one integrated force, and you don't ask a question when you believe you already know the answer. The Drevaan Corridor campaign had cost us the assumption. I'm not certain what it will cost us more broadly. That assessment is still being written. What I am certain of is this. When the Strategic Council asks me how many human response systems we have not yet seen, the accurate answer is that we don't know. We have a lower bound, which is the inventory we've encountered. We have no upper bound. We have a sample that has been drawn from a population we don't have the right tools to characterize. And we have, from the Drevaan footage, the image of 2 pilots crossing between structurally different systems, as if the difference were a matter of degree rather than kind. As if whatever made them human pilots made them capable in any human system, regardless of who built it. I have thought about this last point more than any other in the 6 days of transit. It is the one that unsettles me most, not because it is the largest strategic problem. The unknown inventory is the largest strategic problem, but because it points at something about the humans that I don't fully understand and that the formal assessment does not fully address. The systems that appeared in the Drevaan Corridor were, as I have described, structurally different. Different development lineages, different engineering philosophies, different performance envelopes. If you showed the technical parameter sheets for the first system and the 5th system to an analyst who had never seen human development records, they might not conclude that these systems were built by the same species. The differences are that substantial. And yet pilots crossed between them, not just tolerating the differences, but adapting to them quickly enough to remain effective within an engagement. What does that tell us about the humans? I think it tells us that whatever the independent development programs were optimizing for, they were all optimizing in ways that were legible to the same kind of mind. The systems are different, but the humans who fly them are, in some relevant sense, the same. Whatever training or experience or cognitive architecture, allows a human to operate one of these systems also allows them, with adjustment, to operate another, even when the other was built by a completely separate program on a completely different set of design choices. This is either very encouraging for the humans or very troubling for us, depending on what you're trying to do with the information. For the humans, it means that their dispersed development architecture, which looks wildly inefficient on resource allocation grounds, produces something an integrated architecture cannot easily replicate: a personnel pool that can be redistributed across any system in the inventory, because all the systems are, at the level that matters to a pilot, variants on the same thing, not technical variants, something deeper. Something about what it means to operate a machine in a contested space, to make decisions under pressure, to adapt when the expected technique stops working. Whatever the humans train for at that level, they train for it in a way that transfers. For us, it means we cannot exploit the seams between the programs. In a normal multi-program architecture, one that actually exists somewhere, not a hypothetical, the different programs produce different systems, and the personnel trained on one program's systems cannot quickly transfer to another program's systems. This creates seams. If you can neutralize one program's asset pool, the other programs cannot easily compensate. But the Drevaan footage suggests that human pilot competence is not program-specific. Neutralizing one program's assets does not reduce the effectiveness of the other program's pilots, because those pilots were already cross-capable. I have no formal recommendation to make about this, because I don't yet understand it well enough to recommend a response. I'm noting it in this record because the Strategic Council should know that I've identified it as the question I am least able to answer, and that in my experience, the questions I am least able to answer are the ones that most need to be worked on. There is one more thing. In the hours after Keth-Vraani left the briefing suite, I reviewed the engagement logs again. Not the technical data, I had reviewed that exhaustively over the preceding days. I reviewed the footage itself, the visual record of the 6 engagements as captured by our sensor arrays. In the third engagement, the first one that had produced a system we hadn't anticipated, there was a sequence I had noted in the technical analysis but not fully absorbed at the visual level. At a moment of significant pressure in the engagement, when the Keth-Vraani tactical element had found a gap in the third system's defenses and was pressing it hard, the pilot had done something. They had changed the engagement axis entirely, abandoned the corridor center approach that the system's doctrine favored, moved to the corridor wall, and used the geometry there in a way that none of our prior contact records showed this system type capable of. It was improvised. There was no record of this technique in any prior encounter with the third system. The pilot invented it, in contact, under pressure, in real time. And it worked. Not decisively. The engagement eventually resolved in our favor, but it worked well enough to cost our tactical teams several minutes and force a doctrine adjustment. The pilot had looked at a situation that was going badly and produced something new for it. I reviewed all 6 engagement logs looking for similar moments. I found 17 of them across the 6 engagements. 17 instances where a human pilot under pressure did something that was not in their prior contact record, not a variant of a known technique, something new. I have no way to know whether these 17 improvisations were drawn from training that we simply hadn't logged, or whether they were genuine real-time inventions. The honest answer is it doesn't matter much. Either way, the human pilots were demonstrating an ability to respond to tactical pressure with solutions that did not appear in the pre-engagement database. Whether that database failed to capture their full training repertoire, or whether they were capable of generating genuinely novel responses under pressure, the operational outcome is the same. Our tactical teams could not fully anticipate what the pilots would do, because the pilots sometimes did things that hadn't been done before. I filed the assessment when the Sovrith call made contact with the home system relay network. The formal language is precise and appropriately hedged. This record is the fuller account for the council members who want to understand not just what we found, but what the finding means. The Directorate went into the Drevaan campaign, believing it had mapped the ceiling. 6 systems appeared in 6 engagements. 4 of them were unknown to us before the campaign. 2 pilots demonstrated cross-system competence. 17 moments of tactical improvisation appeared in the engagement logs, and the corridor is in contested status. There is no ceiling we can map. There is only the ceiling we have encountered so far, and the awareness, hard purchased and not yet fully priced, that the distance between those 2 things is larger than any of us had projected, and that the humans appear to have no particular interest in letting us close it. That is the report. The rest is what the council does with it.